I want to invite you to be in community with me, right? I want to invite you to be in this space, in this room, fully present. You can check your fantasy football scores later. I would be checking mine out there if I were out there, unless somebody said check them later, then I'd check them later. Um, and Facebook's not going anywhere, unfortunately. And I mean, it just, I want to invite you to be present. And because I think what we're going to talk about today, and I don't say this like lightly, I think it has the potential to change the world. Like I really do. Um, I want to invite us to reopen our lives to church, which I know sounds weird because you're like, what are you talking about? I mean, we're sitting in church right now. What do you mean in reopen our lives to church? I want to invite us to do that. I want to invite us to reopen our lives to what church is, what it means, and probably most importantly, what is the church's power? Like, how is it that it changes the world? What does it do in the world that like makes an impact? How does it happen? Because right now, most people don't want to associate themselves with church. Like there's a lot of disenfranchisement with church. There's a lot of people who feel hurt by church, and a lot of people whose hurt is completely justified. There are a lot of people who look at church and they see Christian nationalism and they're like, I don't want anything to do with that. So today, I want to see if we can possibly recapture, reimagine, and reopen our lives to church. Before we do that, my mouth is dry, so just talk amongst yourselves while there may be some of you here who don't know who I am. Before I get into some of that stuff, my name is Corey, and as Travis said, I have a wife named Julie who couldn't be here today because we have a new addition to our family, not a baby, but a dog. Her name is Rue. She's a 4-pound Pomeranian Maltese that my oldest daughter, before she went away to college, just randomly bought and brought to our house. We came home one day, and no lie, there was a puppy in the living room, and I'm like, whose dog is this? And she's like, this is our dog. And I'm like, that's not our dog. Like, we don't have a dog. And, I never saw myself being a dog person, but today I'm absolutely like, oh my God, I'm the biggest spoiler of this dog you'll ever see. In fact, I was walking in here and I saw there was a dog outside, like on a leash. It was just barking. And there was a lady, it was kind of odd. She was just kind of standing there, staring at the dog. And I thought she's either a dog napper or a really bad dog owner. And I felt really, really bad for the dog. So I kind of like, my heart was breaking for the dog, which never would have happened before, we had our puppy. So my wife had to stay home to take care of the puppy. And my youngest daughter is also at home. And then my 2 older daughters are off in college. We recently pushed them out of our nest at college. I thought I'd be much happier about being almost empty nester, but I am totally sad all the time because my friends are gone, man. Those were my friends that I ran around the house and played with, and now they're now gone. I kind of understand why in the ancient fairy tales people lock their children in towers. You kind of like keep them from going anywhere, Those of you that like have small children, I'm telling you right now, best advice I can ever give you is to be present because it goes by super fast. And everybody always says that, and you're like, yeah, right. I'm covered in whatever you're covered in when you got babies. And you're like, this is never going to go away. It is. It goes by really, 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 really fast. So make sure that you stay present with him. I'm going to tell you a story. I grew up in church. My dad was a pastor. We grew up in a church that was in the middle of an under-resourced community. In this under-resourced community, there was like all kind of violence and drugs and just all kind of stuff. I mean, I'd hear gunshots all the time in the neighborhood. But what was interesting is that everybody, our church was the largest structure in the neighborhood, so everybody knew that was the church. There was just stuff you didn't do there. We didn't chew gum inside church. We would like dress up for church. Like the minimum, you had to have a tie on. Like I could never walk in my church with holy jeans and a sweatshirt. I mean, there's just no way. The church was too holy and too sacred for that. The space was, right? You could cuss outside, but you weren't going to cuss inside a church. Like you could do anything. All kind of stuff happened outside the church. Like I said, it was an under-resourced community, and in under-resourced communities, what winds up happening is people have nothing but bad choices in front of them, and so they make the best of the bad decisions. And this is what was happening around our church. And one day I was I was outside, and across the street from us was my best friend in the neighborhood who coincidentally was accused of, I'm not sure he did it, but he may have, broken our house while we were out of town. This is my best friend in the neighborhood, some friend. And then his older brother, who taught me karate, not like actual official karate, because I don't know karate. I can't fight to this day. But like he was like, I'd call him like a hood Mr. Miyagi is what he was for me. Like he taught me, some stuff. Maybe I'd handle myself a little bit, but and then they had an older brother who I never really interacted with. So I'm outside, the thing that kids used to do before the internet, and I'm outside playing, and I look and I hear this noise across the street, and when I look across the street and I see my karate instructor's older brother outside with some other guy I'd never seen before, and another guy who he punched in the face and kicked down the stairs of his porch. And this was like a little bit frightening to me, because I'm like 8 years old. It was a little bit scary. But it got a little scarier when he reached in his waistband and pulled out a gun. And he pointed the gun at the guy. Now, I'm standing here like 8 or 9 years old. I'm watching all this happen. And I'm not like scared that I'm going to be shot. My heart's racing because I'm seeing a gun pulled on somebody for the first time in real life. I mean, I've seen it on TV, but in real life to see a gun pulled on somebody was super wild. And he looked across the street, saw me, put the gun away, and let the guy go. And I don't know if he did this because like everybody recognized that this is the church and this is the pastor's son, and so like, if you can't cuss in church or chew gum in church, you certainly can't kill somebody out in front of church. Like maybe that's what I don't know what he thought, but something there happened, and I can't help but think about the sacredness of what church can represent in the lives of people who are in trouble. Like people who are desperate, people who are under-resourced, people who are without power, people who just are in need of an example of something different. I can't help but wonder if there is a way of us reopening ourselves to that kind of power in church. And so what I want to do for the next few moments, I've been really, to be honest, been really nervous about this part because there's a lot of stuff I want to say to you. I don't know how I'm going to say it. There's a lot of stuff I want to say to you, and I want to get beneath the surface of something that maybe you've heard before. How many of you heard this sentence before that Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church"? How many of you, just a show of hands, have heard that before? Okay, online I see a couple people with their hands. Got you. All right. I want to get to like what that means. When I was like a couple years ago, I was, I'm, as you can probably look at me and tell, I'm very athletic and into sports. I don't know if you can look at me and tell that I'm really athletic, but I'm super athletic. Probably the best golfer at this church. Yeah, since Ray nor JP are here to call me a liar. You are there. Is that who is that? Is that JP up there? JP is in the house. I didn't recognize you with the mask on and it being dark in here. But so I was a big fan of Allen Iverson, right? And I remember when Allen Iverson had his press conference. Maybe you guys have heard it before. You guys have heard of Allen Iverson before, right? You guys remember the practice? What are you talking about? Practice, man. What are you practice? Practice. We're talking about practice. He has this really famous press conference where he's saying practice over and over again. And the narrative that came out of this press conference was that Allen Iverson hated practice. That's the message that came out of this moment because people didn't know what happened behind the scenes, and I didn't know what happened behind the scenes until I watched the documentary, and I saw that Allen Iverson also grew up in a under-resourced community. Allen Iverson was an all-state football player as well as basketball player, and got in an incident where he was just recognized at a bowling alley and got arrested. Because his friends got into something, he got arrested. I didn't realize that Georgetown, where he went to college, was like a rescue. It kind of rescued him from prison. And so Allen Iverson went on to have this basketball career, but he still had friends that were back in under-resourced neighborhoods who were doing what you do when you're in under-resourced neighborhoods. You make bad decisions because you only have bad decisions in front of you. And the night before this press conference, Allen Iverson's best friend had been shot and killed. And so when you watch the press conference, you see practice juxtaposed against professionalism in playing games, when Allen Iverson was juxtaposing practice to real life and pain. And he said, y'all in here talking about practice, and my best friend got killed yesterday. When you hear that in context, you go, oh, wait a minute, what I thought about this moment, what I thought about this sentence, what I thought about this is completely different because I got the context to it. And oftentimes, because this is what happens in the West, because the West has been colonized. And what colonizers do is colonizers take a little bit of culture, just enough of the culture to keep them in power, but not enough of the culture for that culture to maintain its dignity. And even in our study and reading and thinking about these ancient Jewish texts and customs and practices and traditions in the West, we often take a sentence that Jesus or Paul or Moses or Abraham said, and we build just enough of it to keep us in power without actually recognizing the culture that undergirds and supports the thing that was said. And so I want to take a few moments to get into what's behind this thing. When Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I want us to get to some of the culture behind it, some of the history, the context, what was going on that made Jesus say this, and then we might be able to discover or reopen ourselves to the power that the church has. Is that, you guys good with that? Sounds all right? I'm going to have some more water. You just say hi to your neighbor one more time. So in Matthew chapter 16, there's this story, and you don't have to go there. I'm going to tell you what happens. All right? I'm going to tell you a little bit at a time, and we're going to try to slow down. And at the end, Travis is going to come up, and we're going to talk about it. So anything I might have skipped over, Travis will be able to help me make sure I tell you everything that I need to tell you, because it's really important that I tell you everything I need to tell you. All right, so in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus is in the beginning, kind of in a back and forth with religious leaders from that day, which if you read the Gospels, it's kind of crazy how much Jesus is in these conflicts with religious leaders, like going back and forth with them all the time. And they're so nitpicky, it's just super annoying. They are the most annoying Karens you can ever find. I'm sorry if your name is Karen. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about, Karen as like in, never mind. Just forget I said it. But they're the most annoying, like, Facebook trolls, we'll say that, like, that you can ever find in your life. They just, like, were always nitpicking, like, well, why are your disciples not washing their hands? Or why did you do this? Or why did you heal this man? Or why is this guy walking? Why is this guy blind? Now he says he can see. And they were always missing out on what Jesus was doing to nitpick at, like, the details that didn't matter, that no one cared about. And they're just always doing this. And I imagine Jesus was, the Jesus of history, who I want to talk about today. The Jesus of history was a Jewish rabbi who was a man who walked the earth, who could probably be just as annoyed as any of us would be at people nitpicking us all the time. And so he's in one of these moments, and they ask him for a sign. And I can really identify with this whole asking for a sign thing, because there's a part of being a communicator, like when you say stuff, whether you have a podcast or you're a pastor or especially when it comes, you're dealing with like religious texts and spiritual people. There's a lot of nitpicking, and there's a lot of like, prove it. There's a lot of like, well, you said that, prove it. How do you know that's true? And you're like, hey, I've read probably 100 books on this subject, and you've read a blog. I mean, that blog could be more informative than the 100 books I read, but it's unlikely. But this is what happens, is that there's this prove it that happens. And I imagine Jesus was like, I just don't have time. I'm not proving it to you. In fact, he says to them, I'm not giving you a sign. And in my mind, the Jesus that I imagine, history probably stuck his tongue out at him, because that's what I would have done. Like, I'm not giving you a sign. Forget y'all. And then he goes across the sea with his disciples. He's in this region called Caesarea Philippi, which I'll explain a little bit about what this is in a moment. And in this region of Caesarea Philippi, he says to his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they start, saying, well, my cousin and them said that they thought you were Elijah. And then, like, this guy over here thinks you're Isaiah. My mom thinks that you might be like a prophet or something, but I don't know. And then Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, "You are Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says to him, Peter, what blessed are you? What you just said, the epiphany you just had didn't come from your upbringing. It didn't come from like your background, didn't come from your father, your mother. It came from the Spirit. And then he says, on this rock, I'll build my church and the gates of hell won't prevail against it, which is a little bit confusing because the word Peter means rock. And so from there, a lot of folks kind of believe that Jesus built the church on St. Peter, and that's where you kind of have some confusion throughout history about what Jesus was actually talking about. But I want to give you my take on what Jesus was saying. So I want to go back to where they were. They were in this region called Caesarea Philippi. And in Caesarea Philippi, there was a lot of pagan ritual that happened, like super weird pagan ritual. There was a god that they worshiped whose name was Pan. And the god Pan was a god who was said to have the head of a goat and the body of a man. Now, I don't know about you, but like if in order for there to be something born that's like half man, half goat, that like there'd have to be some weird stuff happening. Like some farmersonly.com kind of strange stuff happening for there to be a half man, half goat. And so the people in this region, one of the ways that they worship this god Pan was to engage in some strange rituals. I'll just call it that and leave it alone. And so that's where Jesus brings his disciples, and they're here in this region where people are engaged in these. I would hope that they weren't, doing the ritual right then in front of them, but they do this here. And where they did it was at a place that I've actually been to in Israel. It's actually a cave with a really spooky, ominous-looking opening, especially during certain times of the year where the water kind of collects at the bottom of this cave and the mist rises up. So people thought this was the entryway to the underworld, where the god Pan was God over this underworld. And so they came to this cave, and what they called it was the gates of hell, or the gates of Hades. That's what this place was literally called. So Jesus is standing here with his disciples at the gates of Hades, where there is this pagan ritual that is super strange to this god Pan, who was the god of the underworld, that I imagine lots of people were afraid of, that I imagine lots of people had all kinds of odd and strange feelings about, that I imagine a lot of people felt enslaved to. And he's standing here with his disciples, has this conversation. He says, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, this that you see right here, this ritual, this strangeness, this way that people feel like they have to access spirituality, this gate right here, this way that people think this is how we will make our connection to God. He says, the gates, this will not prevail against the church that I will build. And when I hear Jesus say on this rock, I want to back up to something else that I want to make sure we don't miss. Because when I was growing up, Jesus Christ, I always thought like Christ was Jesus' last name. Like it's like Jesus, like my name's Corey Leak, his name's Jesus Christ, nice to meet you. Like I just kind of thought that's what it was. And then, as you get older and as you start to really study it, you realize, oh, Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's actually just the Greek word for Messiah. What's interesting about this word Messiah is that Jesus is not the only person to whom Messiah is assigned in Scripture. In Isaiah, God talks about a man named Darius, who was a Persian king, who helped liberate the children of Israel from Babylonian captivity. The literal word that they use for Darius is Messiah. Now, if you guys didn't have masks on, or if I could see your faces, I imagine you're looking at me really strange right now, like, what? What do you mean? Hold on, somebody else is Messiah? I'm surprised there's not like tomatoes flying at me right now. But that's the reality, is that there was a liberator who showed up, who was called the Messiah. Because there's something to this word Messiah. Again, to get to the culture of it, the word Messiah has liberation connotation to it. It's about freedom. It's about rescuing. In fact, in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is in the synagogue, he stands up to read, And he reads from Luke chapter 4 when he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed. That word anointed is actually another word that means Messiah or Christ. He has anointed me to deliver good news and to liberate those who are oppressed and to give good news to the poor. To proclaim the year of Jubilee, which is the year of freedom and liberation. So what Jesus has in Luke, when he first announces to everyone this idea that he himself is fulfilling the promise of the liberator, he is saying, I'm here to bring liberation. So if we go back to what Jesus says, on this rock, where after Peter says, you are the Christ, you're the Messiah, you're the liberator, Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church. What rock? Liberation. On setting people free from their bondages. On setting people free from the dishonor and shame that can be brought on them through white supremacy. On setting people free from feeling like they can't have dignity, they can't be a whole person because they identify as queer. I will build a church that gives people liberty and freedom. That will be the rock that the gates of Hades that binds people to ritual and practice that they may not even want to be a part of. The church that I will build will not succumb or not be beholden to a church where people nitpick, where people are always asking for a sign, or where people are bound to practices and rituals that don't bring life but only bring death. I think that's a good place for a so be it. In my opinion, like from you, not y'all just from you to say amen. I don't know, that's a good place for that. That the power of the church is in liberation. It's in providing freedom. But to go back even a little bit deeper and even further back, when Jesus says this word church. So Jesus uses a word that is translated in the Greek to ecclesia. The word ecclesia means gathering. So in fact, lots of versions of the Bible now, I think there's now like 8 million versions of the Bible that you can choose from, which is a conversation for another day. That there are versions out that say gathering, community. And somehow along the way, because this is how words work, this is how things work for us, because we are moving so fast that we don't really always take the time to really understand what we're saying when we say things. I struggle to say I'm going to church. In fact, we were a couple years ago. One of the reasons I come here is because I admire Travis and Jenna, because they did something that I couldn't do. They planted a church. A couple years ago, we thought we would start to try to plant a church, and I was like, this is the craziest thing. But why would anybody ever do this? But I struggled to call it church. So I'm like, I don't know that what I want to be clear about what I mean when I say church. And as I described the thing that I wanted it to be, people were like, yeah, people aren't going to recognize that as church. You don't get to redefine it for people, which I guess is true. Because over the years, people began to believe that church is either a building, which you, being that this is the second building we've been in, you can't possibly believe that the church is a building because you're somewhere else. Otherwise, the church is over there at the school. That's the school part of the time. So sometimes it's school, sometimes it's the church. This was kind of weird. Well, other people may believe that church is about what you do in it, right? Like, we got to sing some songs, and someone's got to stand up and preach to us, and then we have some announcements, and then we'll go home, or maybe we'll be a part of a small group. Is that church? Because if that's church, that doesn't have power to change the world. Not just that, not just singing songs and hearing somebody say some stuff to you that maybe you didn't know, or maybe some stuff you could have read. In fact, in this day and age, like to gather, put yourself at risk, have to wear a mask the whole time. There are 9,000 million speakers right now on YouTube better than me at communicating. So is that church, the fact that somebody can speak well, that people can sing well? I think we have to reopen ourselves to something different. Jesus is talking about something different. They had a place where they gathered in the temple. They gathered in the synagogue. He was talking about a community of people. And here's what blew my mind when I thought about this week, right? When the next thing that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 16. He says, I am giving you. Now, this is a group of fishermen. This is a group of people who, because they were following Jesus, they were following Jesus late in life, had already not been selected as religious leaders. These were dirty fishermen. These were not people who like had graduated from whatever upper echelon, seminary you graduate from back then. These were people Jesus is talking to. They're not professional religious leaders. These are fishermen, and Jesus looks at them and says, I am giving you the keys to God's way of functioning in the world. I'm giving you the authority to help shape what a world governed by God would look like. And then he says this. Let's bear in mind that Jesus of history is a Jewish rabbi who was part of a rabbinic tradition. In fact, many of the stories that Jesus tells aren't original to Jesus. Some of the things that Jesus says, other rabbis were saying. He was putting his own twist on it. Jesus was a part of this rabbinic tradition. In fact, that's why people would come up to him and go, Rabbi, because he dressed like one. He carried himself like a rabbi. So, and as a rabbi, there was this thing that religious leaders did called binding and loosing. And binding was that a rabbi had the permission to, or the authority to, by being a rabbi, by being the rabbi, which they got from the rabbi that they followed, the permission to take the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, and to interpret it. So, as an example, whenever you see Jesus go, you have heard it said, but I say to you, Jesus was binding and loosing as a rabbi. He was saying, you've heard this, I'm loosing you from this, and I'm binding you to this. So Jesus says to his disciples, I'm giving you the authority to speak for God. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. One other thing to get beneath the surface of this. In the scriptures, the writers of scripture, you'll see heaven, you'll say bound in heaven, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whenever you see heaven in these kind of contexts, it's heaven because Jewish people thought that the name of God was so sacred that they didn't want to write it down or say it. So they substituted with things like the name or heaven. So in essence, what Jesus is saying, whatever you allow, God will allow. Whatever you do not permit, God will not permit to this group of fishermen. The larger message that I think we need to get today is that Jesus said to these disciples, God trusts you. God trusts you. God has trust in you as a follower of Jesus to be administrators of God's way of being. He trusts you to show people what love looks like. Now, here's the part of this I don't like, that I don't like at all. I wrestle with this. And maybe some of you have this tension because you have this, well, what if we get it wrong? What about hold on, if God, wait, there has to be, you mean I can bind him? So you mean I can say, you've heard it said that if you're part of the queer community, you're going to hell, but I say to you that God still loves you? You mean, but what if people disagree with that? What if somebody else is, God trusts you. And here's an example of how much God trusts you. In the very next part of Matthew chapter 16, Jesus is telling the disciples that he has to be crucified. And Peter rebukes him. And Jesus looks at Peter, who he just said, on this rock I'll build my church. God trusts you. He says, get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're talking about. But notice what he doesn't go on to say, I take it back. Can't bind and loose anymore. I take it back. He didn't take the keys back, even after Peter crashed the car. Because God's not like us in that regard. And here's what I don't like about it. There are people who preach things that are really dangerous, in my opinion. oppressive. There are theologians and scholars who had helpful things to say, who also did not renounce slavery. Some owned slaves, but they could bind and loose. I wish they couldn't. They could. There are people who have said things that led to Christian nationalism. People who are part of the reason why so many people are hurt by church and why so many people are disenfranchised, they can still bind and loose. So what do we do? How do we reopen ourselves to church? How do we reopen ourselves to this power? How do we reopen ourselves to this idea that Jesus says, God trusts you? We govern ourselves. We constrain ourselves. We bind ourselves to community. We bind and loose in community. The disciples, after this, were headed into a world that was constantly changing. And I'll give you an example of the authority that the disciples carried after Jesus was gone. In the book of Acts, there is this moment where there's some back and forth about letting the Gentiles into church. Actually, to be honest with you guys, if people did not take the binding and loosing serious, we wouldn't be talking to each other right now. At least not in this context. They were having this conversation about whether or not non-Jewish people could participate in this, in their religious practice, in their traditions, in their customs. And a lot of Jewish people, because of the scriptures that they believed and the teachers that taught them, they weren't like just mean people. They fully believed that what they were hearing about Jesus was dangerous, was dishonoring to God. Paul was killing Christians not because he was this violent, murderous person, but because he really believed that the spreading of this new thing was dangerous to the world until he changed, until he witnessed Jesus. But these folks having this debate over whether or not non-Jewish people could enter into the church. There's this moment where James says something that is fascinating. James, who is one of Jesus' disciples, he stands up and he says, "It seems right to us and the Holy Spirit that we should not make it hard for people to enter into God's kingdom." It seems right? Like it might be a good idea, maybe. I don't know. I mean, let's just try it. That's what that sounds like to me. And these are the people that God says, I trust you. Fine. If you say they can come in, I say they can come in. And God's given us a lot of power, a lot of responsibility. And we can wield that responsibility in ways that just causes us to have more power, which is what we see happening. When we see Christian leaders getting really close to really wicked authorities in the world so that they can keep their tax status, or so they can maintain more power. When we see that happening, that's a misuse of the power that God gave them, but it's still the power God gave them. And we have a responsibility, all of us who are people who want to operate from an ethos of love, people who are saying, like James, how can we make more room at the table, not less? People who would say, I'm totally fine with Christians being mad at me because I tried to make more room for people. I'm totally fine with Christians being mad at me because I believe that matter is the minimum when we're talking about black lives. I'm totally fine with Christians being mad. Those of us who find ourselves in that place, we're saying, I just feel compelled to follow this Jewish rabbi into spaces that invite more and more people. We see Jesus talking to women. No other rabbi did that. We see Jesus sitting down with tax collectors. They didn't do that. Jesus was so unorthodox and so welcoming of people in the way he carried himself that even John the Baptist was like, "Hey man, are you really like the one, or should we wait for somebody else? Because you're doing some strange things with some strange people." And it may be time for us to start uh, inviting some strange people into our space, into our community, whether we sing or don't. See, because you take church with you to work and school. You bind and loose at work. There are people who come to your job bound with anxiety, who feel that this pressure to perform all the time. You have the power, the authority to say to them, you don't have to perform all the time. I know you've heard it said that you got to work 60, 70 hours a week to be productive, but I say to you, you can be a whole human and be tired sometimes and ask for help sometimes. Spend the day in bed sometimes. While I was wrestling with anxiety, I spent lots of days in bed and had to learn not to feel bad for it. Had to learn not to feel bad for admitting to people that I've had anxiety. Because we live in this performance-oriented world that just wants us to always put our best foot forward and look great and don't show any weakness. You've heard it said that if the survival of the fittest, and if you show weakness, you'll be annihilated in this capitalist society. Well, I say to you, by the Spirit of God, that we can regain and maintain our humanness, which is incredibly sacred. Because as I stood as an 8-year-old boy out in front of that church, it wasn't the building that saved that guy from being killed. It was the sacredness of an 8-year-old boy who represented all the things that God is in the earth. And you can do the same.